Palmetto Island was unlike any place I'd ever been. It wasn't your typical island surrounded by water, but it was wrapped in dense vegetation that felt like a natural wall, cutting you off from everything else. The only thing breaking through the thick greenery was the narrow road leading in and out. Inside, the resort had its own little world, where the trees grew so tall and close together that they formed a canopy, blocking out most of the sunlight. The roads weren't meant for cars, only golf carts or small bikes. If you left the paved paths, you'd find yourself in a maze of trees and thick bushes. It felt like the forest was alive, watching your every step. The campsites were scattered, each one tucked into its own quiet corner. It gave you privacy but also a strange sense of isolation. There were recreational areas and playgrounds for families, but the forest was never far. The further you walked from the beaten paths, the more it felt like stepping into a different world, a darker one. Even during the day, the air in the forest felt cooler and heavier, like it was hiding something. At night, the place took on an entirely different mood, one I didn't fully understand until it was too late. It was a typical evening at the campground. My family and I had spent most of the day together, enjoying the playground and the open spaces. The place felt safe, familiar even. I had made a new friend while playing, and before I knew it, the hours had slipped by. One by one, my family members left the playground, assuming I'd catch up with them soon. Eventually, my new friend had to leave too, and suddenly, I found myself alone. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the ground. I wasn't worried. This wasn't my first time at Palmetto Island. I thought I knew the area well enough. I figured the walk back to our campsite would be quick and easy. But as I started to make my way back, something felt off. The paths that had seemed so clear during the day now looked different in the fading light. It didn't take long for me to realize that I had no idea where I was. At first, I thought I could find my way back if I just kept walking. The campground wasn't that big, and I was sure I'd eventually see something familiar. But the more I walked, the more lost I felt. Every path seemed to lead somewhere new, and none of it looked like the way back to our camper. Soon, I found myself at the boat launch area, a spot I hadn't seen before. A small group of people was there, chatting and unloading gear. Desperate, I decided to ask them for directions. Not wanting to reveal exactly where my family was staying, I lied about our campsite number, telling them it was further down the road than it really was. They pointed me in what they thought was the right direction, and I thanked them before heading off. As the minutes turned into an hour, my legs grew tired and the sky darkened. I kept walking, hoping I was getting closer, but instead, it felt like I was walking in circles. All I could do was hope my family had noticed I was missing and was out looking for me. I had been walking for what felt like forever, and my legs were aching. The only sounds around me were my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The campsite should have been nearby, but there was no sign of it. The deeper I went, the more I realized how far off track I had wandered. Out of nowhere, a car pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and I recognized one of the people I had asked for directions earlier. He smiled and offered me a ride. At that moment, I was so tired and desperate that I didn't think twice. I climbed into the front seat, hoping this would finally take me back to my family. At first, everything seemed fine. We were headed in the right direction, and I felt a bit of relief. But then, the car passed the entrance to the campsite. My stomach dropped. I told the driver he had missed the turn, but he didn't respond. That's when I knew something was very, very wrong. Panic started to set in as the car kept driving further away from where I knew the campsites were. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced with what to do next. Just when I felt completely helpless, I saw something up ahead, a golf cart heading straight toward us. As it got closer, I realized it was my dad. Without thinking, I started yelling and waving frantically. The driver hesitated for a moment, but kept going. My dad must have noticed me, because he drove straight toward the car, forcing it to stop. The driver froze as my dad got out, pulling out his concealed carry weapon and pointing it straight at him. I didn't wait for instructions. I unlocked the car door, jumped out, and ran to my dad as fast as I could. Safe in his arms, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. My dad kept the driver at gunpoint until the police arrived, and the nightmare ended right there on the side of that road. The police arrived quickly, lights flashing and sirens breaking the silence of the night. They took the man into custody, and I watched as they questioned him right there on the spot. It wasn't until later that I learned the truth that sent chills down my spine. The man wasn't just some stranger with bad intentions. He had a history, and his entire family was involved in similar crimes. They had done this before, luring people into their car and getting away with it. Hearing this made everything sink in. I kept replaying the moment in my head, how close I had been to something terrible happening. My dad's quick thinking had saved me, but the what-ifs haunted me. What if he hadn't been looking for me? What if he hadn't noticed the car? I didn't want to think about it, but the thoughts were hard to shake. That night changed the way I see people and places forever. What started as a peaceful camping trip ended in a way I'll never forget. Looking back, I can't help but feel both lucky and terrified. If my dad hadn't acted when he did, this story could have had a much darker ending. It's hard not to think about the close call and the kind of danger that can hide behind a friendly face. That man and his family had done this before, and they almost got away with it again. This experience taught me a lesson I'll never forget: never trust strangers, no matter how kind or helpful they seem. Always stay alert, and if something feels off, trust your instincts. I try not to dwell on the fear, but it's a part of me now. When I think about Palmetto Island, it's not the trees or the playgrounds I remember. It's the moment I realized just how quickly things can take a terrifying turn. Even now, years later, the memories of that night linger. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen my dad or if he hadn't recognized me. The thought alone is enough to send chills down my spine. But what stays with me the most isn't just the fear, it's the realization of how fragile safety can be. I share this story not just to relive it, but as a warning. We often take little things for granted, like knowing our way back or thinking we'll always have someone watching out for us. But danger doesn't always come with a warning sign. It can be quiet, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment we let our guard down. I'll never forget what happened at Palmetto Island, and I hope you won't either. Sometimes, it's not just about surviving an experience, it's about learning from it, so you don't end up in the same place. Stay safe, always. As I started exploring the campground, the emptiness became more noticeable. The trails were overgrown in places, as if they hadn't been used in a long time. Picnic tables sat untouched, covered in leaves and dirt, and the fire pits looked like they hadn't been lit in years. The place had an abandoned feel, but everything else seemed normal, no signs of danger, just a strange lack of people. I kept telling myself it was fine. Maybe the park wasn't as popular as I thought, or the other campers were staying at a different section. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. Every now and then, I'd stop to listen, expecting to hear voices, laughter, or even the crunch of footsteps. But there was nothing. only the sound of my own breathing and the wind moving through the trees. The silence felt heavier with every step I took. I tried to convince myself that being alone was a good thing, but deep down, I couldn't ignore how wrong it all felt. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I stumbled upon something unexpected. There, attached to a tree, was an old wooden box. It looked weathered, like it had been there for years, but it was firmly locked with thick metal latches. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, symbols I didn't recognize but couldn't stop staring at. They seemed ancient, almost ritualistic. I reached out to touch the box, and a chill ran through me. The wood felt rough, but there was something almost alive about it, as if it was waiting for me to open it. I tugged at the latches, but they wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't open. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, but another part felt drawn to it, like it was calling me. I couldn't explain the feeling, but something about that box didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just curiosity, it was fear. I stepped back, deciding to leave it where it was. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the sensation that the box wasn't done with me yet. Later that evening, I decided to take a walk down to the lake. The air felt heavier as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. When I reached the water, I immediately noticed something strange. The shoreline had pulled back, far more than it should have. The water level had dropped significantly, leaving muddy patches and exposed rocks behind. The smell of rotting vegetation hung in the air, strong enough to make me gag. As I stood there, staring at the murky water, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a piece of driftwood sticking out from the surface. But the more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't wood at all. It was something else. The shape was odd, almost like a hunched figure, half submerged in the water. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the fading light made it hard to see. Then, for a brief moment, it moved, or at least I thought it did. A shiver ran down my spine as the wind blew across the lake, and I could have sworn the shape stretched, as if it was reaching toward me. Without my glasses, I couldn't be sure, but I didn't wait to find out. The sunset was beautiful, but I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. Something about the lake wasn't right, and I knew I didn't want to be near it after dark. By the time I got back to my campsite, the sun had completely disappeared, leaving everything in darkness. I lit a small campfire, hoping it would ease the tension I was feeling, but the flames only cast flickering shadows that made the forest seem even more alive. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. It felt like the trees were closing in, watching me. The box and the figure in the lake were all I could think about. The more I tried to shake them from my mind, the stronger the unease grew. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting something or someone to step out of the shadows. My firewood ran low, but I couldn't bring myself to venture into the woods to gather more. The thought of being out there in the dark sent chills down my spine. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, hoping to get some rest. But the silence of the night was suffocating, and my thoughts wouldn't stop racing. Every creak, every faint sound outside felt amplified, like it was happening just inches away. I lay there, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, feeling completely exposed. Sleep never came, only the growing certainty that I wasn't alone. When morning finally came, I didn't waste a second. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my hands trembling with every movement. The light of day didn't ease the dread that had settled deep inside me. I just wanted to leave, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was lurking in that place. As I loaded the last of my gear into the car, I noticed a familiar item missing from my pile. My favorite Zippo lighter was still on the picnic table by the campsite. I stared at the empty table for a moment, debating whether it was worth going back for. The fear from the night before made me hesitate, but I couldn't bring myself to leave it behind. After a deep breath, I started the car and drove back toward the campsite, telling myself I'd grab the lighter and leave as fast as possible. But as I pulled in, what I saw made my stomach drop. The campground wasn't empty anymore. It was full of activity, as if the eerie silence of the previous day had never existed. I parked and stepped out of the car, feeling completely disoriented. The once empty campground was now bustling with life. Tents were pitched on either side of my old campsite, and families were chatting and cooking breakfast like they'd been there for days. Even stranger, there was a small store nearby that I was certain hadn't been there before. It felt like I had stepped into an entirely different place. Walking toward my campsite, I spotted my lighter sitting exactly where I had left it, glinting in the sunlight. The sight confirmed that this was, without a doubt, the same spot. But how could everything have changed so drastically overnight? As I picked up the lighter, I noticed one of the rangers nearby and decided to ask him what was going on. "Has the campground always been this busy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The ranger gave me a puzzled look. "What are you talking about? Most of these people have been here since yesterday," he said before quickly walking away. His response made no sense, and the way he avoided further questions only deepened my unease. Something wasn't right, and I could feel it in every part of me. I got back into my car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I tried to make sense of what just happened. The ranger's response kept echoing in my head. How could those people have been there yesterday? I'd walked through that campground, and it was completely empty. I hadn't imagined it. There was no one. And what about the store? It wasn't there before, and now it was impossible to miss. The drive home felt like a blur. The further I got from the campground, the more questions raced through my mind. What was that box in the woods? What was in the lake? And why did everything feel so different the second time I returned? None of it added up, and the harder I tried to find answers, the more confused I became. Even now, sitting here, I can't shake the feeling that I missed something important. Something I was never meant to see, or maybe something I should have stayed far away from. That campground isn't just a place I visited, it's a place that will haunt me forever. Since I left, I can't stop replaying everything in my mind. The empty campground, the strange box, the thing in the lake, and the sudden appearance of people and activity, none of it makes sense. It feels like the pieces of a puzzle that refuse to fit together. Every time I try to explain it to myself, I end up with more questions than answers. Was it all in my head? Did I somehow imagine the silence and isolation? Or was there something real, something I wasn't supposed to find? The more I think about it, the more I feel like I stepped into a place that exists outside of what we know. A place that shifts and changes when you're not looking. I don't know if I'll ever go back. Part of me wants to, just to see if the campground is the same again. But the thought of being there, of feeling that dread and confusion again, keeps me far away. Some things are better left unexplored. Sometimes, it's better to let the mystery stay a mystery,